and I typed in, what does a CEO do? Because people talk about this title, what does a CEO do? Because I'm standing at the front of all these people and I could not stop, this is God's honest truth, my left leg shaking. And it was really shaking. What was really evident to me is the skill set to turn a business round is really different to the skill set to grow a business. And I really wasn't sure I would have the skill set to grow a business. So then she went, I bet he phoned you about an honour. And I said yes. And you think it's a prank? I said, yeah, completely. She said, no, it's not.
What was the actual underlying reasoning or justification for why you work so hard and why you prioritised your career so much to the neglect of your personal life?
I've worked out that my career has been driven by one thing, and I'm not sure it's a good driver of a career, which is
Welcome back to another episode of the People, Property, Place podcast. Today, I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Kevin Aitchison, MBE of Savills Investment Management. Kevin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Matt. It's good to be here.
Not at all. Well, look, you've had a fascinating career, and you've led a lot of teams. I know you're a big advocate of leadership and management, and you've got a big interest in wheelchair rugby as well. And we'll come on to some of the lessons, having been a CEO and a leader of some amazing organisations such as ING and Knight Frank Investment Management. But before we get on to that and some of the lessons and the journeys and the reflections, can you cast your mind back and tell me a little bit about how you got into real estate in the first place?
Yeah, well, like most people, didn't really know what I wanted to do, but my dad was a quantity surveyor. So he said one day, any plans? I said, not really. And then it was applying to university. Oh, I think I'll apply for quantity surveying. But then he said, no, that's dying because of computers. You want to go for general practice surveying. So I applied to Reading Uni, got offered a place. And then I decided I needed a fallback position because the grades for Reading were quite high. And my older brother was at Liverpool Poly studying building surveying. So I went up to the open day that happened to be on a Friday and stayed for the weekend and had such a good time that I then wrote to Reading University and said, could I change from general practice to building surveying? So hence I became a building surveyor project manager all those years ago.
So you graduated in 87.
Yep.
And if my research is correct, you landed at Clutton's?
I did, yeah. I'd worked there in my last summer at uni, which was great because when I finished, they offered me a job to come back, which wasn't so great. It meant I didn't work that hard and got the old famous Desmond, as we called it, Desmond Tutu. So, yeah, that's how I got there.
So you're a bit lazy or you just kind of knew?
No, absolutely not. I just had a really good final year.
So as a kid growing up, what kind of kid were you? I think you mentioned that you're middle of three boys.
I was a bit of a worrier. I worked hard, loved sport. Wasn't very good at it. I was sort of okay because I tried really hard, but not naturally gifted. Yeah, that was my upbringing, really. Great group of school friends who are still my friends today, which is brilliant. So, yeah. And
your dad was a quantity surveyor, so that was your kind of
route
was. In.
Yeah, my older brother is a building surveyor, or now retired, but that was how I so during holidays I would work for various surveying firms or on building sites or whatever just to earn some money. So that was really how it wasn't a passion. I'd love to sit here and say real estate was a passion. It wasn't a passion.
Was there pressure from your dad to go into real estate?
Absolutely not. Never mentioned it, not once I can remember. But it was just the world I knew, really.
And so your older brother did building surveying.
Yep.
And what was it about building surveying that was particularly interesting?
Fantastic weekend in Liverpool.
That was literally it.
Pretty much.
And so at that stage, there was no kind of further foresight or kind of career planning?
No. Again, I'd love to sit here and say, yes, I had this aspiration to be this, whatever. But no, not at all. It was just going to uni, what am I going to study? And the rest would follow afterwards.
So you landed at Clutton's and you did building surveying. Did you have to do some rotations to get any sort of letters or qualifications?
No, so you did 2 years and then you took your professional exams, which luckily I managed to pass. And then I sort of developed and did more project management. So I was running contracts, refurbishment contracts and the like. So yeah.
And was that across asset classes and sectors?
Oh, literally, it would be. I mean, I've done things like created. There was one building in Bow Lane in the city where we put Next in on 3 floors. It was an office building, and then built 18 residential apartments above. Did office refurbs, did due diligence surveys. It could be anything, and pretty much any sector, less residential than anything else.
So someone listening to this who doesn't know what a building surveyor does, can you just provide a bit of context on
building
where they fit in?
Yeah, so a building surveyor, so at Clutton's, they had a brilliant client list. They worked for the Crown and the Church and other similar sort of historic estates. So let's take the Church. They would own lots of residential units, lots of commercial units. We would refurbish them when they became empty. We would do building surveys if they were buying something new. If you had a commercial tenant and the lease was expiring, we would do dilapidation inspections. So it could be anything to do with maintenance, refurbishment of properties and due diligence.
And did you enjoy that part of the real estate world, or was it just a route in and a first step?
I would say I was never naturally a building surveyor. So it's quite technical, and I don't really have the patience for the technical part of it, I would say. So I would say I was very average.
So how long were you a building surveyor for?
13 years being very average. Yeah, 13 years.
And you got promoted through the ranks, or?
Yeah, I left as a partner in 2000 and joined a company called Baring, Houston and Saunders.
So before we come on to that, you spent 13 years. Did you get to a stage where you kind of looked ahead, and did you always want the next job on the rung, or was it just a case of the career and the trajectory, you just kind of went with the flow because that's where the opportunity was?
So I would say I went with the flow, but I suspect some of my friends would say I'm quite driven, whereas I don't particularly think I am, but a lot of people who know me well would say I'm quite driven. So, yeah, but I wasn't outwardly thinking, oh, I've just been made an associate, when am I going to be a partner? I didn't outwardly think like that.
So what was your thought process? I just want to do really good quality work?
Yeah. I've always believed if you do a good job, you will get the recognition. And sometimes I feel one of the failings today is people want the recognition, the money, before they've proved they can do a good job.
So you wanted to let your results do the talking.
Yes. Yeah.
And by doing a really good job, you had faith in the system that you would get promoted.
Yes. And for me, that worked.
And that's why you spent 13 years there.
Also, I worked with some really good people. So it was good fun as well.
So the culture kept you?
The culture was good. The culture was quite old-fashioned. So I don't know if you know anything about Clutton's, but they were the oldest surveying company in the country, dating to 17 something or other. Client list to die for. Subsequently, sadly, went bust, but resurrected themselves, largely on the back of the pension fund, as many companies have. But in the building surveying project management division, let's call it a division, it was just a really, really good bunch of people. Great boss, sadly passed away this year. Just a good place to be.
So what would you say your gifting was at that particular
My gifting?
stage? Yeah,
I'm not sure I have any particular gift apart from I've always worked quite hard, and I think I'm quite lucky.
Apart from that final year at uni?
Apart from that, yeah. It didn't really matter.
But you've always applied yourself, worked quite hard.
Yes, I've always worked quite hard, yeah.
Do you feel you've had to work harder than your contemporaries or your peers?
No, not really. Not really. I think most people work hard, they will get the rewards. I think you need a bit of luck along the way. You need people who believe in you, who give you the opportunity. And I think a lot of that comes back because of your own. I suppose the one thing I think I am not bad at is the people stuff. I'm quite a good communicator. I'm very open as an individual. I have been accused of being too open. But I've always found that, if I'm honest, if you're open with people and you communicate, people tend to be more supportive of you. And that served me well. I was lucky.
And do you think you've always done that? Or is that something you've kind of had to grow into as you've risen up the ranks and taken on more leadership positions?
It's an interesting one, that, and I don't know the answer. So my first direct boss, a guy called Richard Lodge, he told me that when I first joined Cluttons, I was really cocky, which I wouldn't have thought was true, but apparently I was. But yeah, if I always thought that I'm a good communicator, probably not. I don't naturally think I'm that good at anything. I just think I work hard, and that has sort of driven me on.
There's working hard and then there's being smart and efficient as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm smart and efficient.
You just work hard.
Yeah.
Bit of a blunt instrument.
Yeah, that's how I would put it. Maybe I'm doing myself a disservice.
I'm sure you are. I'm sure you are. I think there'll be a lot of people listening to this who are probably very, very surprised to hear that, given the career that you've had. So you spent 13 years, and on one hand, people think that you would have thought you kind of went with the flow a little bit.
Yep.
Others would have thought you'd been very driven to rise up to the ranks of partner after 13 years. Why did you decide to leave after 13 years? And was that a bit of a, come on, Kevin, snap out of this, take a little bit more control of your career, or?
No, it was very different, actually. So I probably, in my last few years there, spent about 80 to 90% of my time working for a business called Baring, Houston and Saunders. So Baring, Houston and Saunders was 2/3 owned by Barings Bank. And Robert Houston, as in the Baring Houston, was the CEO of the business. And when Barings Bank went bust with Nick Leeson, they were bought by ING Real Estate. But I spent 80 to 90% of my time working for them. And then one day, they were in the city, I was in the West End, and they asked me to go over for lunch. And over lunch, I was questioned about where I saw my future. And at the end of lunch, one of the guys there, a guy called Nick Cooper, said to me, "I think you've outgrown Cluttons." That was it. So off I go back to the office thinking, "Ooh, what do I make of that?" And that was it. And then about a month later, they invited me over again and offered me a job as an asset manager, to which I can recall sitting there saying, "What does an asset manager do?" To which their answer, "Works buildings, you understand buildings, you've worked on a lot of their buildings, doing different things.
Refurbs, delapse.
All that sort of stuff, yeah." So off I went thinking, what do I do here? And I always felt I wasn't a natural building surveyor. And I can remember going to the pub with my dad. At the time, we both lived in the same village, talking about this. And he said to me, so I'd just been told that in a year I would get equity partnership at Cluttons. And I remember sitting down with him over a pint, and he said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I don't know. It's a really difficult call." And he said, "If you don't accept it, will you always wonder?" To which I said, "Yes." And he said, "You've got to go." So then I had a chat with my wife and said, "There's a bit of a risk involved with this." And I went. And by a mile, it was the best thing I've ever done in my career. And, Nick Cooper, the guy who, funnily enough, was chair of Savills Investment Management until a few months back when he retired, has had a massive influence on my career. And I would say that was a big turning point for me. I went to do something where I didn't, let's be frank, really understand exactly what the job was. And then people would start talking about valuation, which I thought was some sort of dark art that I would never get to grips with. Then I realised it wasn't. So, yeah. But you see, I mentioned earlier, I think you need a lot of luck. And that was a rare opportunity. Someone that I'd known for a few years as a client supposedly saw something in me and supported me.
What do you think he saw in you?
I don't know.
You haven't asked him?
I don't know, not really. I don't know.
Because you're right, it is an interesting move going from building surveyor to asset manager.
Yeah, I mean, there are a few of us. I'm not alone in doing that.
No, sure.
But it's a different, there are certain things you haven't done, such as valuation. I don't know what he saw in me. I mean, we always got on well.
Well, split it out, you've got the technical attributes, which you'd have done some of, but not all of. But then you'll have the behavioural attributes that will be more universal across role type. And it must have been the behavioural pieces that...
So if you look at investment asset management, what is the job? And I described it recently. I said to someone, we're owned predominantly by Savills, not only, but predominantly. And I said to someone, we do everything Savills do, but we don't do anything. So we buy, we sell, we lease property, we do building surveys, but we actually don't do anything. So what do? We manage the people that we employ to do all of those things. And I can only think that he thought I'm someone who has the ability on the people side to manage people. I can't really put it down to anything else.
And as a partner, were you managing a team at Clutton's?
Small team, but as building surveyors, you tend to work. It's quite, funnily enough, very unlike what I do now. Most people operate in relative isolation. There are very few. So if you're doing a due diligence survey, you'll go out probably on your own. You might have a graduate with you. If you're project managing a construction project on site, invariably you'll be doing that on your own. Again, you may have a graduate who's helping you. But it's rare you do things in big teams. So it's actually quite, I've never thought of that before. It's actually quite different in that sense.
So you moved. Can you recall the conversation with your wife? Because your dad said you got to do it.
See, I mean, my wife's always been great. So she was, look, if you think it's the right thing to do, I'll support you in that. So I took a pay cut.
You took a pay cut as well?
I did take a pay. I'm not sure what I was doing.
Ill-advised. No,
probably ill-advised. Probably ill-advised.
So you took a pay cut,
yeah,
and you not missed out, but you decided to not go for the equity partnership.
Yeah.
12 months down the road.
Yeah. But it was the best thing I ever did.
And age and stage, you were early 30s?
I was 34.
Kids? Mortgage?
No, I had 2 kids by then, and the third on the way, I think. Yeah, mortgage. Still got a mortgage today. So, I mean, when I look back, it was a risk, but at the time, it just felt like the right thing to do.
So what was the role you were going to actually do?
Asset manager.
So be an asset manager, but actually do what?
So I suppose, what's the definition of an asset manager? Is to work the assets and create value. So I don't know, an example might be you might have a retail warehouse unit and it might be 5,000 square foot and there's big demand for 6,000 square foot. This is really simple. And so you extend it, you get planning and extend it. That would be the sort of thing asset managers might do. How can you either add value in good markets or maybe mitigate value loss in bad markets? So it's really about working the individual assets.
So were you given a portfolio of assets from day one?
Yeah, many of which I'd already worked on as a building surveyor.
So you knew them?
Yeah, probably half of them, quite a few.
And so were you quite commercial as well?
Poor. I don't know. I tell you what was interesting though, is my thought process was different.
To the other, maybe asset managers who've come from a valuation or L&T or leasing background.
Yeah. So, I mean, in silly ways, I can remember in the early days, we went and looked at a building owned by one of the clients and the fund manager was standing there saying, I want to do this, I want to do that, I want to do the other. And I'm saying, you can't do that, you can't do that, because my knowledge base was different. And that's always stuck with me because I'm a bit of a fan of having people from quite diverse backgrounds in a business or in a team. I think that makes a big difference. So it wasn't better or worse, it was just different.
And so you could get to the punch faster or you could advise?
No, not necessarily. It would mean I brought something different to the equation.
And so collectively you could get to the punch faster?
Yes, that's a better way of putting it, yeah.
Because you knew the legislation or...
that sort of stuff, yeah.
Law
so what could you do from a planning perspective? Is a building listed? What are the implications of that? You just had a different type of knowledge.
And did you like being on the principal side rather than the advisory side? And did that move come naturally to you?
I would say... yes, I did, but here's an interesting one. So I would have said to you before I moved that I completely understood what an investment manager did and why. When I got there, I realised I didn't.
You're not the first person on this podcast to say that.
Yeah.
A lot of people have said, there's almost an arrogance or an expectation. They know exactly what to do.
Yeah, because you work for them day in, day. You think you know exactly why they're doing something, and you don't until you're actually in there.
So was that a big shock for you, jumping on the other side?
Yeah, I think I hadn't appreciated how... I mean, I'm not sure arrogance is the right word, but a naivety is probably a better word of what the client was actually trying to do. And I hear often to this day service providers saying, yeah, no, I understand it, all of that. And I'm not sure they always do.
And is that because they don't understand the bigger picture in terms of where the fund or the business and where it's trying to go? They just see it through a very small lens of this is the asset and this is actually what success looks like for the asset. And so they're advising based on that rather than understanding the bigger picture.
I think that's spot on. But it is a two-way thing. So a great example, as a building surveyor, we would do due diligence surveys. This is a silly example, but it is an example. And a client is buying a building and you go off and do a survey. And in a normal survey, this office here, you'd look at everything, condition of the fit out and everything else. But if the client has said to you, we're going to buy it, gut it, why would you look at the fit out? Or if the client said, we're going to rip the cladding off the front elevation just back to structure, you're going to do a different type of survey. But people don't always, I think it's better today than certainly when I was doing it. People don't always ask the questions and the client doesn't always give instructions which cover those sort of things.
So did you ask good questions when you were a building surveyor? And
No, I don't think I did. I think I was the same as most people. I do think it's better today, to be fair. I think the industry continues to... I think the industry was quite immature, and maybe in some ways it still is today, but has definitely developed far more than it was 25 years ago.
So when you moved to Baring, Houston and Saunders, did you... And you touched on kind of maybe that leadership and that communication piece. Is that where you had to develop those skills to steer and direct third-party service providers to get the result or the report or the valuation that you needed or wanted?
I would say I probably already had them, but without knowing I had them. But again, others may tell you that's not the case. But I don't remember thinking, I'm really not quite sure how to manage all these people. Maybe it's the one thing which I sort of does come semi-naturally to me.
How did you kind of progress through ING?
Through there. So we became ING obviously when they bought the Barings share. So basically started off as an asset manager, then became portfolio manager. A lot of client contact, huge amount of client contact actually. The boss at the time, who was the founder of the firm as well, a guy called Robert Houston, we converted into having effectively 3 divisions, of which I ran one, which was the sort of segregated accounts. So a lot of quite personal client contact.
So a segregated account for someone listening to this?
Yeah, sorry. So that could be, I don't know, one of them would have been Dorset County Council, had its own allocation to real estate, and rather than going into third-party funds, had its own real estate portfolio, which we would build, look after on their behalf, etc., which meant you had very, very regular dialogue with the clients. So I ran that, and we had some great clients back then: Cadbury Schweppes, Xerox, Arga, Dorset County Council, West Midlands. Some really, really great clients. So I did that.
And as a portfolio manager rather than an asset manager, you're responsible for driving the value of the assets, but setting the direction of the portfolio? Strategy,
yeah. So essentially I would say when you get to that level, your job is about delivering the investment performance. So if the client says, I want 7 to 8% over a 5-year time horizon, we would then devise a strategy for delivering that, and then client signs that off, and then you're responsible for executing it. It's quite interesting because unlike many things you do, whether you're successful or not, there's no hiding because it's measured independently by MSCI or IPD as it was then. So you can't hide. Your performance is measured. That's quite unusual in life, I think. So there's pressure from that.
Because if you're not performing, they'll RFP you and stick you with another manager.
Then you're off, yeah. But what's interesting about that, because that is what happens, but what was really evident when you got to the global financial crisis is this comes back to the communication piece. If you have a really strong relationship with the client and things don't go well, you're given time to turn it around. If you don't have much of a relationship, it's too easy for a client just to say, I'm going to RFP it.
So how do you build good quality relationships with your clients?
Just communication and spending time with them. putting yourself out. I mean, I had one client, actually, Cadbury Schweppes, he's no longer there. And we were just talking about, he was a big runner. Now, I've always been into exercise, not really into running until COVID hit. And he said, and I'm guessing this was about 2008 or 9, and we were talking about running, and he was doing half marathons. And he said, why don't we do a half marathon together? I'm thinking, I've never run anywhere near that far in my life. But there's me saying, yeah, okay. So I went and stayed at his house, and we did the Yorkshire, I think it was called the Yorkshire White Peaks Half Marathon, which seemed to just go up and up and up for 2 hours. But how good is that for having a really close relationship with that guy?
Did you run with him for that whole 2 hours?
No, he was better than me. But I still see him now. Not often, but occasionally.
So how do you go from service provider to really strong relationship with your clients? Because I think that transcends, all things from portfolio management to, institution that you're working with.
Yeah.
It works from kind of investment agent to principal. It works when you're kind of a capital raiser.
It
works everything, right?
So I don't think there's a single answer to that. But my view to it is it's all about, I've mentioned communication, and I'm sure I will from the rest of this chat a few times. I think that's key. But equally key is transparency and integrity. So if things go wrong, it's very easy just to sort of, lift up the carpet and brush away. Whereas I would always say, you just come clean. We've got a problem. The important bit is this is what we're going to do about it. And I've found that if you do that, people might be annoyed with you and they might vent their frustration, but they're going to stick with you, not least because they respect your integrity, the fact that you've held your hand up and say, we got this wrong, but this is what we're going to do to sort it out.
Yeah, there's two parts to that. There's one is like the owning.
Yep. But accountability.
The accountability is saying we've messed up or this is the issue. But the other part of that is then saying this is the solution rather than just here's the problem.
Yeah, and the second bit is critical.
Yeah, because otherwise it just doesn't land, right?
No, you've got to have the solution bit. You've got to have that.
And do you offer 3 solutions and say this is the pick? What do you think? Or do you come with just one?
I think it depends what the problem is, but invariably we'd probably just come with one. Most of the clients are not real estate people. They're looking to you for your expertise, and then you stand and fall on delivering the solution.
So you moved from asset management to portfolio management, and you were responsible for looking after 1/3 of the business, the separate account side.
Yeah.
How did that role evolve, and from an AUM perspective? Talk to me about some numbers that you're responsible for.
Cool. It's a long time ago now, so I'm guessing a bit. I'm guessing that when I got that role, we were probably about 1.5, 1.6 billion. When I moved on to a different role from there, we'd won a few mandates. We were probably just over 2 billion. I mean, I'm going back about 17, 18 years, quite a long time. I think we were reasonably successful. I'd be lying if I sat here and said everything we did was fantastic, performing fantastically. We had some stuff which was great, some stuff which was sort of probably middle of the road, but middle of the road is often fine for a client as long as you're delivering the returns they want. And then there were 1 or 2 that don't do so well, where you may have called it wrong. And anyone who tells you that's never happened is almost certainly lying, because everyone gets decisions wrong.
You became CEO.
I did, yeah.
Talk to me about that.
It's like the blind leading the blind. So I'd been there 8 years, just under 8 years actually, and it was announced that my boss, Robert Houston, was becoming global head of ING Real Estate. And back then, ING Real Estate Investment Management was the biggest investment manager in the world. It had over $100 billion. It was huge, and was truly global. And Rob was appointed as global head. And it was quite interesting because I'd only been on the board for about, 6 months, I think. So I'd only been in investment management for 8 years. There's all these people that are far more experienced than me, and I'm thinking, this is going to be interesting. And clearly a few people were overtly keen on the role, and you can see a little bit of jockeying for position, but the culture of that business was great. So it was, it wasn't overly competitive. And then one day Rob said, I've recommended to the global board that you get this job as CEO of the UK. And I went back to my desk. This is true. We're in open plan and I'm doing this. And I typed in, what does a CEO do? Because people talk about this title. What does a CEO do? That was quite interesting. And
So you got a tap on the shoulder to basically say,
yes.
I've recommended to the global board that you're going to be the next CEO.
Head of the UK, yeah. CEO, only of the UK, not all of it, but yeah.
And you walk back to your desk and you Google,
what does a CEO do?
What does a CEO do?
I did, yeah, I did. And the answer is virtually everything is people related. Virtually everything. And I did say to Rob, my boss, I said, why me? I'm the least experienced person here. And he said, this was 2 weeks after Lehman's went under, global financial crisis.
2 weeks after?
Yeah. I knew about it before, but I was in post 2 weeks after. And he said, because the next 3 years are going to be a nightmare from a people perspective.
And it's not like you even put yourself forward for this job.
No, not at all.
You were just kind of carrying on.
Not at all. I didn't think for 1 second, which is why then I thought, God, this is like the blind leading the blind.
But you knew a lot of other people were going forward for it, so you knew it was happening, but you were just quite happy in your own lane.
I just didn't feel I was experienced enough, was good enough, had the necessary skills, and who knows, maybe I didn't.
But because of Lehman, they wanted someone at the helm who had very strong people skills to be able to manage that through.
I'm not saying I've got strong people skills, actually. That was just my boss's answer to the question. Yeah.
So is that a case of going back to your wife that evening and saying, I've got no idea what a CEO does, but I've been given the
I think I went home and said, oh God, I've been put forward for this role and it'll be like the blind leading the blind. So, yeah.
And what did she say?
I can't remember. She probably thought, more stress. But I don't know. I can't remember. A long time ago.
So the GFC happened and 2 weeks post Lehman, you were appointed as CEO.
Yeah. Horrible time.
What are your recollections and memories from that time?
Horrible time, but a fantastic time. It sounds a bit odd. And the amount I learned was just unbelievable. So I was in post, knew a lot about a third of the business, not much about the other 2/3. We, like most people, had been positioned for growth. We had a lot of people. We had been making a lot of money. So I decided I would spend 3 months trying to understand the 2/3 of the business that I hadn't been working in. But it became really evident really quickly that we had far too many people because we were positioned for growth. So at this point, I'd never run anything, so I didn't really know what I was doing. So I called.
And so just, you position for growth is in big headcount, big overheads, so big kind of cost base.
Yes.
And typically people is your largest
for
cost
a real
base.
estate I am by a long way. So I
to service what the deals or the transactions that you were looking to do and the fees that would come off the back.
But the market had changed overnight, more or less. I mean, over a relatively short period of time. So I spent probably about 3 weeks doing that, and then it became really evident to me we had too many people. So I called a staff meeting we were in London Wall at the time, and I stood up in front of the business and said, we're going to be making, I think I said about 35 redundancies. We were probably about 150-ish, 155. And I can remember that day because I'm standing at the front of all these people and I could not stop. This is God's honest truth. My left leg shaking. And it was really shaking. And I couldn't physically stop it shaking.
And was this the first time you'd addressed the whole business as CEO?
Yes.
3 weeks after post.
Yeah. And it was just a horrible thing to do. Do I think that was the right thing to do? I mean, I believe in transparency and being honest. So yes, I do. Whether I did it in the right way, I don't know. And I got my numbers seriously wrong. And I can remember going off to talk to one of the non-execs on our board, and I was telling him about this, and he said, it'll be at least 55, 60. And I said, no, I've really sort of put a lot of thought into it. He said, he was a lot older. He said, I've been here a few times. It's always more. And he was spot on. So we ended up doing it twice, which is from a morale point of view, a nightmare. So it was a horrible time. And of course, as with any firm, when you make people redundant, you talk about it's not personal and all this. And it's not, but it is. For the individuals concerned, it's frankly pretty horrific. But the good, I said earlier, it was a horrible time, but it was a great time. And we got through that. And why do I say it was a great time? Because at the end, there were 4 of us in the leadership team left during most of it, actually. All 4 very different people. But boy, were we pulling in the same direction. That for me was such a great example of the importance of the leadership group. Don't have to like each other, but they have to respect each other, and they have to bring different skill set. So they all contribute their own bit. But the most important is that you're just going in the same direction. You're trying to achieve the same ends. And in that sense, it was great. And I learned so much. There'll be a lot of things I would have done differently. I say a lot. I probably couldn't list them, but I know there were things that if I was dealing with them today, I would have dealt with differently. But that's the learning curve, isn't it?
The piece I find interesting about what you've just said is the fact you don't need to like them.
No, you don't, no.
But you need to respect them. Why don't you need to like them?
These aren't your drinking buddies. I mean, they may be. But invariably, they are people who, their ambition has to be to deliver for all your stakeholders. And a stakeholder for a real estate IM would be our investors, the people who own us, our staff. I mean, they're probably our 3 groups of stakeholders. And there could be someone, as it happened, we all got on really well. We did like each other. But it wouldn't have mattered if you didn't, as long as you had similar values, you approach the issues in a collegiate way, which I think is so important and is sadly lacking at times. And you're just trying to achieve the same aims. And I can remember one day I came in, and it was relatively early days, and there was I can't even remember what the problem was. There was some problem. And I remember sitting in my office thinking, oh, no. And the FD was a guy called David Love, Kiwi. One of the most efficient people I'd ever worked with. Back then I can remember he used to do 9 to 5, rarely worked long hours, but would be more productive in those hours than most people at, if they work 7 till 7. Highly intelligent. I remember this day I'm thinking, yet another problem. David comes in, he's like, right, what are we going to do? How are we going to move this forward? And it really sort of made me think, yeah, okay, because there is always a solution. There is always a solution or a way of mitigating your downside. You've just got to find it. And if you approach that as a team, your chances of finding it are far better than trying to do it on your own.
And coming with that energy. And
the energy. And that rubs off on other people. And I would say one of my weaknesses is sometimes I lack that. Sometimes things can drag me down. And then someone else comes along and just lifts you up and off you go.
So you were CEO through a really, really challenging period, and you did that job for 3 years.
3 years, yeah.
By which stage you'd, back of a fag packet maths, 20 years or so, worked on the tools in real estate through building surveying.
Yep.
And as an asset manager and portfolio manager.
Yeah.
So kind of 20 years, you kind of transitioned
24 years
away
by
from that.
Yeah.
To being more of a people.
Yeah, I suppose so. I've never
manager.
Looked at it like that, but yeah, I suppose that's true.
Because I've heard you say before, your real interests are the people, leadership and management.
Yeah.
Rather than real estate.
Business. Yeah.
And it's business and it's the people
Yes.
aspect. And you can apply that skill set to other sectors and other industries. Whereas a lot of other people come at this from I love real estate.
Yeah. Which is definitely not me today.
So how kind of having done that role for 3 years led a turnaround or reposition the business? Why did you decide to leave?
So ING were bailed out by the Dutch government and were forced to sell non-core business, of which real estate was one. ING being bank and insurance company. So they sold us to CBRE Global Investors, as was. And I could have stayed. I was offered a role to stay, but for one reason or another, not really sure why. It was a bit impulsive on my part. I decided it wasn't for me. And Fortunately, during the sale process, which took best part of a year, I had been approached by Knight Frank, who wanted to grow an investment management business. They had one, but it was, I think, 3 people and probably a few hundred million at the time. And so I decided I wasn't staying, handed my resignation in, and then I'm thinking, I haven't got a job to go to. And fortunately, they were still there. And I joined there. So I went from working, forget my responsibilities in the UK, from what had been the biggest real estate investment manager in the world to one that had 3 or 4 people and a few hundred million. That's an eye-opener. On your first day, you're thinking, who's going to do that? And then you're, I am. And they were like chalk and cheese. And I'll tell you what was really interesting was we managed to turn a business round through having I would say I had some brilliant people around me. That wasn't my doing. It was the quality of the people around me. We were a relatively big business. And then you go somewhere that's really small. And what was really evident to me is the skill set to turn a business round is really different to the skill set to grow a business. And I really wasn't sure I would have the skill set to grow a business because I don't think I'm particularly entrepreneurial. I think I work hard. That's it. But again, I managed to get great people around me. See, I've just lived my career by having great people around covering for me.
Let's come back to that point.
Right.
At ING, did you make some really good money?
What, personally or for the company?
Well, personally, in terms of the exit of the business, I know maybe
not really.
Forced. So it's not like you made life-changing money at that particular stage.
No. But compared to the average person, people who work in real estate are paid really well. My wife manages a preschool. There can be 65 kids there. She's the manager, aged 2 to 4. She gets paid not far off minimum wage. And I sometimes think we forget. So for me, money's never been my driver, ever. Don't get me wrong, it makes life easier, but it's never been my number one driver. By the way, I halved my salary when I left ING. I probably shouldn't say that on film, but yeah, I did.
There's a theme here, isn't there?
Yeah, it's mad. I'm mad. Yeah,
you're a maybe not a headhunter's dream. You're the next employer's dream. Take a pay cut each time. Property is a people business, hence the name People Property Place. Business has been tough the last couple of years. Get the people aspect wrong, business becomes impossible. Get the people aspect right, it's still hard, but it's manageable, much more enjoyable, and you're much more likely to hit your goals. So if you're looking to add top talent to your team in 2025 and you're open-minded to an alternative approach and you're keen to make business a little less hard, drop me a DM. I'd love to have a conversation with you to see how Rockborn could potentially help you with your human capital requirements. Right, let's get back to the podcast. Just picking up on a point you mentioned there is a very different skill set in terms of turning a business around compared to growing or launching or starting one.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is getting really good people around you.
I think that's critical.
And a lot of people say that. And I feel, maybe it's a reflection on myself. You hear that in theory, and I don't think you realise how important it is until you've maybe had a couple of misstarts.
Yeah.
Or you've kind of learnt the lesson for yourself.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Also, you watch how other people operate, how leadership teams operate. And when you see a leadership team where they're clearly not all pulling in the same direction, I think that's really obvious. Really obvious. And I've been lucky. I've worked with some brilliant people in my career. So
you got the tap to go to Knight Frank Investment Management. 3 people.
Yeah, I think it was 4 actually. I might have been
four people. And a little bit of cash under management. What was the vision that you were sold, or what were you there to go and deliver?
So I joined, I'm guessing you know of Alistair Elliott, who was group chairman, senior partner.
He's no longer there, and he's chair at London Metric.
All sorts of places, yeah. Alistair is a really top guy, and I suppose I got to know him quite well because ING was a client of Knight Frank, and always gone well with him. And he's someone I really respect. So his vision was to grow an investment management business. They're global, but they don't have they did have an IM business, but it was tiny. And the remit was as simple as, we want to grow an investment management business. And I have to say, as an owner, they were brilliant. They never interfered. I would report into their global board once a year. They were unbelievably supportive. Alistair personally was really supportive. It was just they were a good owner, put it that way, and they left us to it. And let's be frank, Knight Frank is a lovely firm, but you stand and fall. And if we hadn't managed to grow it, they would have definitely chopped it, I have no doubt, after a period of time. But we did manage to grow it through a lot of luck and a lot of hard work and just getting as many balls up in the air as you can and hope that a few come down. Unfortunately, we had a few that came down.
So what was the first job that you did at Knight Frank IM? As in, the first thing on your kind of agenda that you needed to get right to scale this business?
So I think the first thing we really did was go and run around and talk to a lot of the clients, the consultants in particular, who are the gatekeepers to a lot of the pension fund money, and just sort of tell them, we're here, this is what we're trying to do. I mean, it was always going to be a slow process, because I would say the IM business then, which I say was very small, was probably treated a little bit as a department within Knight Frank. We can't operate like that, same as Savills Investment Management. You have to be a standalone business, because there is an obvious conflict between an IM business and a property services owner, because we use Knight Frank because they were good, in the same way Savills IM will use Savills because Savills are good. So there has to be a separation. And that was quite a big thing at the start, was to be able to build a clear separation. We ended up moving them out of Knight Frank's office into our own office in the city. And it was just creating, so it was really evidently a standalone operation run on a day-to-day basis, on a standalone basis. And they were tremendously supportive of that.
So from day one, was it cash flow positive? Was it profitable?
I would say it probably was till I joined. And I managed to persuade my chief investment officer from ING to come with me, who is a man that I trust completely and is very good at his job. So when he and I joined, it became cash negative. Yeah.
But you had the backing.
We had the backing
from Alistair.
Yes.
And
not just
Knight
Alistair,
Frank,
the board, but yeah, they were very supportive
to scale it. So the first thing was to go out and tell the community that you were here, sell the vision, mission, and what you were looking to do.
Exactly.
And where did the first break come from?
I think the first thing was luck's one of my themes, was luck. Someone came through the Knight Frank website, a Saudi family who were looking to buy commercial real estate in the UK, and it came to us, and we met them a few times, developed a relationship with them over time, and then eventually they committed and we built them a little portfolio. So we did that. Then we managed to win a Mundi. We built a portfolio for them in the UK. That was quite good for us because a Mundi are a big name, and we managed to win that. So there were sort of little wins, and we spent a long time in Korea, lots of trips to Korea, knocking on people's doors. And the problem with international money, and most of the money, new money is international, is fully understandably, it takes time to develop relationships. And trust has to be a big thing, particularly with international clients when you could be 5,000 miles away from each other. So you have to build up that trust, which takes time and repeat visits, etc., etc. So we spent a lot of time traveling. But yeah, the first win was the Saudis, and then we won a Mundi, which was great, various Korean clients. And I think our big breakthrough was probably about 2015, 16, when we launched the Long Income Fund, which we raised not shy of £1 billion for through Willis Towers Watson, one of the big consultants who backed us. We had an idea. They quite liked the idea. We worked it up with them into a sort of more detail and what they thought might suit their clients. And then they said to some of their clients, look, we quite like these guys. We like their idea. It's worth having a chat with them. And it went from there.
So you scaled it through separate accounts through to raising a fund effectively.
Yeah.
It was anchored on long income.
Yes, we were quite a boring investor. Nothing wrong with boring, by the way. We were quite low risk. We were very focused on income, which my own view, by the way, real estate is about income. It is. If you look back over 40 years and you look at a bar chart showing real estate, the income, even during all the downturns, is relatively consistent, whereas, of course, capital growth is all over the place. So we were a very low risk, income driven investor.
So what was your USP or angle when you were going to go and pitch for this capital?
Cool. Do you know, I don't know the answer to that. We didn't really have a lot to offer apart from brand. Knight Frank's a great brand. And our personal integrity. It wasn't like we could demonstrate 30-year track record. I mean, we did have a couple of clients, actually, that we'd had a really, really long time. But it was really just us. We just had us to sell and the brand.
You were with Knight Frank IM for just shy of 12 years. When you left, give me the headline stats or the figures in terms of AUM and team and some of the funds.
So I think the largest we got to in euro terms would have been about 5 billion, but that was before I left. That was before COVID and all that happened there. About 20 people, probably. Now, I'd say it myself, but some really good, talented people. I think we had a good culture. It's easier in a small firm, though, to create that sort of family feel, let's call it that. So that's where we were, yeah. And our business was, we only had the one fund, but it was quite big. We had Asian segregated accounts, some UK segregated accounts. We worked for one of the big local government pooling schemes. So we had quite a diverse client base as well.
You talk on the fact you brought your kind of CIO over from ING. What are some of the lessons or reflections that you have in terms of being able to scale that business in comparison to turning around a larger corporate?
I think trying to grow a business I found exhausting because, particularly at the start, you have to do everything, or the very small number of people there do absolutely. I mean, I can remember going to Korea, and at 10 o'clock the night before we're flying, we're binding slide decks. Now, today you probably wouldn't do that. You do it on a laptop, but we're binding them in the office at 10 o'clock the night before we're flying. Those sort of things are absolutely exhausting. Becomes very personal. When you're trying to grow something from nothing, it really is very personal. And if you didn't become emotionally attached, I would say you're not normal. You have your own business, and I suspect you're very emotionally attached. That's a big difference to my first role at CEO at ING. It was already a long-established business, very successful, and I just stepped into someone else's shoes. It's very different.
But it's hard to separate. I think you're right. You can become very emotional about things, but that can sometimes cloud your judgment as a leader, where you need to be more rational. How do you balance that?
It's an interesting. I never really thought of that before.
Because I think you need the emotion and that connection to drive you. But there are times where maybe your emotion can cloud your judgment, and you actually need to put a rational lens on things. So you need to make difficult decisions around people or strategy. Or
you are right, and I am someone who, if I get annoyed about something, could get overly annoyed because I'm sort of not thinking about it as rationally as I've sort of learned that if you get annoyed about something and you write an email, you write it and then leave it and have a look at it the following morning. Whereas back then I probably would have just sent it. So that is really difficult. I think you just learn, with the benefit of getting old is pretty rubbish, but it does have some benefits. And I think you just learn that you've got to pause for breath sometimes. I mean, doing the difficult things, redundancies you mentioned, which I never had to do at KFI, but did at ING. I mean, it's just horrible. It doesn't matter how you paint it, it's horrible. But I used to always tell myself that you were doing it because you had to protect the jobs of the majority. That's how I would rationalise it in my head, which I think is true as well. Well, it is true. Didn't make it any easier, but that would be my rationale. So I think you just have to learn coping mechanisms. I can't deny it. At times it's unbelievably stressful. coping with that can be difficult.
You come across as someone who is very calm, very level.
Yeah.
Are you like a swan? Calm on the
I was going to say
on the
duck,
top,
but
or a duck, and frantically paddling underneath. Because you come across as someone who's got a lot of time. You're able to compartmentalize and give a lot of thought and insight, rather than
so if my wife was
running
sitting
around, and kind of onto the next thing.
Yeah. I would say to you, I'm a typical Gemini. So there's two parts to my personality. And if my wife was sitting here, she would tell you, I used to go home from work really stressed, wouldn't talk to anyone. Whereas at work, I am probably most of the time exactly what you just said. But I don't think that's the real me. I think the real me is I am, my legs are flapping around. But you can't behave like that at work. And I know some people do. But you can't if you want to be in any sort of managerial role, let alone a leadership role. So, yeah, I have my moments, definitely. But I would say I'm relatively in control at work, but I'm not at home.
Give your best to work and not quite at home.
Which is terrible, by the way. Sometimes I think we all forget what we're working for. Work should be a means of living, but it's not. It becomes more than that.
So you almost subject your wife to the stresses.
And kids. I could tell you a few stories about that as well. Yeah.
You left Knight Frank in October 23.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Particularly when I've just told you how emotionally attached I was to it. I've always believed that anyone in a leadership position, whatever you do, running a Cub Scout group, football managers, whatever, I believe you have your day and your replacement might just be better than you. But even if they're not as good as you, they could well be better because they bring new enthusiasm, drive, energy, which when you're somewhere for a long time, with the best will in the world, unless you're a really remarkable person, I think naturally starts to drain away, however much you might want to be in denial about that. That's a personal belief, and many would probably disagree with me. And I felt that I needed change, but as importantly for me was I felt the business needed change, needed perhaps new direction. You get, even without realising it, you get very set in your ways at times. And so we had grown it. I always use the word we because it wasn't me. And we'd got it to a certain level. So let's just say for argument's sake, it was 5 billion euro. I felt that to get it to 10 billion euro, needed someone else to come in. Probably look at how we did it. Was it still the best way of doing it? What change was needed? Because you become so emotionally attached to something, I think sometimes it can be quite difficult to make change. So, I can't deny I still miss it. And my successor is a friend. But it was the right thing to do, without a shadow of a doubt.
It's also changes in the market as well. Mid-sized managers.
Yeah.
What's their USP? What's their angle?
It's tough.
Is that kind of S curve? What's kind of got you as you kind of alluded to that point? Reinvent and go again. It's really, really tough.
Really
and we've
tough.
seen quite a lot of M&A or takeovers or people really struggling because the fundraising market is so challenging the last few years. There's definitely been a shift from some of these platforms being all things to all people in terms of their product offering to being very sector and asset class and geographically focused as well, in order to be able to be competitive and raise money.
Spot on.
Was that part of your thinking too?
No, that was 100% not part of my thinking. It was very personal, my reasons for moving on. But everything you just said is true. And I think for a small manager, and that's probably one of the things that Knight Frank IM does need to think about, is what does it want to look like in 5-10 years' time? And I actually think it's easier to think about that with a change in leadership. Just because you do become very set in your ways. And the market is changing. I mean, I'm with you. I think you're going to see a lot more consolidation. over the next 5 years.
Yeah, I think it has to be, especially with with AI and tech and automation and a lot of these. You touched on the pension fund. A lot of these capital allocators are pooling their resources, or they're building internal teams, and they're much more sophisticated than they were previously. There's pressure on fees.
Yep.
And the biggest will get bigger, and then the kind of the mid-cap managers, there'll be pressures around.
You've got to find a niche, probably a specialism.
Yeah. And there'll probably be a bit more consolidation on that side. So you left in October 23. Do you think about retiring or taking a step back?
Yeah, I did. So I can remember saying to my wife, "What do you think about me retiring?" She was horrified, which I thought was very harsh. She was, "What will you do?" And then I asked my kids, who aren't kids anymore, and they were equally horrified. So that clearly wasn't on the table. And then about that time, Savills approached me. The next chapter.
So Savills approached you directly or through a headhunter?
Directly.
It sounds like you've had a lot of your roles directly.
Yeah.
All of them pretty well.
Yeah, I've been lucky.
So you got a tap on the shoulder from Savills. Who gave you a tap?
So the guy, Nick Cooper, who persuaded me to leave Clutton's to go to Baring Houston Saunders, as was ING Real Estate, was the chair of Savills Investment Management until about 3 months ago when he retired.
So he gave you a call?
Yeah, but I also knew Alex Jeffries, who's our CEO out in Singapore. So yeah, I knew both of them well, and yeah, they gave me a call.
So you went in as managing director, head of Europe. So the two prior roles that you had were CEO.
Yeah.
Did you take a pay cut and a job title cut? No, not this time round.
No, neither of those this time round.
But you did move from a CEO to a head of Europe MD role.
Yeah.
So what was the role that you moved into, and what you're responsible for?
So we've got about 25 billion euro of assets under management, but the foundation of our business is Europe, is the European business. So we've got 14 offices, of which 10 are my responsibility in Europe. So I don't know what the figures are off the top of my head, but I'm guessing 80 to 85% of our AUM is in Europe, and probably a similar amount of our people. I'm not responsible for the debt business, which is a separate entity, but the sort of equity side. So I saw it as, yes, you're right, it's a lesser title, but a bigger job, is how I looked at it.
And it's a bigger job in the fact that it's got the European...
Yes. So I travel quite a lot, but it's unlike before when I went to, I'd go to Singapore and Korea and the Middle East. Now my traveling is to Madrid and Milan, which you can do overnight. And it's, it's different. It's different. And the thing I love about it, because I've never really operated, albeit at Knight Frank we were in 6 countries. We didn't operate extensively on the continent, and I love learning. So doing a job like this, you learn a lot. Not least, I love all the cultural stuff, and every country, the cultures are a bit different. And from a management perspective, you need to start trying to understand that, and things you might say in the UK or jokes you might think are funny might not necessarily hit the same chord somewhere else. So the cultural stuff is interesting. I enjoy all of that.
And so your role, is it trying to create more structure, process, integration, and a Savills IM way of doing things between the different offices?
Yeah, that's
and try and coordinate.
Certainly one of the roles I see is making us as joined up as we can possibly be. I think it's quite easy. And I saw this at ING actually, where I was responsible for the UK, but you had all these other businesses, and I always felt there were quite a few silos. So we were the biggest in the world, but we sort of weren't really, because everyone did their own thing. So I'm quite keen on that. Have I solved that yet? I don't think so, but I think we're not bad actually. I think we are pretty joined up across Europe. Got some brilliant country heads who I love spending time with, some really able people. But yeah, you learn all the time, learn new things.
So have you effectively got 14 direct reports in terms of the 14 country heads? Is that how it works?
No, so I've got 14 in total. I'm responsible for 10 countries. Okay. So I've got 10 country heads. I've actually got 16 direct reports, which is more than you probably should have. But yeah, so the country heads report to me.
And you act as kind of a conduit between the CEO in terms of you set the
Effectively.
overall vision and mission and direction
Yeah.
of the business, and you work more on the execution and implementation and
Yeah.
flow through communication and
So I sit on the executive committee, our executive board, and on that I effectively represent Europe. It's good.
Where's the opportunity?
What, in terms of to where you'd invest your money today? So if it was me, my money, I think I would put money in debt, which I think is the case for at the moment, is very attractive because values have fallen. I'd rather invest today in debt compared to when values were really high because your risk is much lower. So I think the argument for that is very attractive. And of course, what you can charge for debt is higher today than it was 5 years ago. I like... it's a difficult question because it probably depends where you're on the risk curve. So let's take me as someone who's relatively conservative. I'd do debt. For the long term, I'd definitely do residential across Europe because it doesn't matter which country you're looking at. The supply-demand dynamics are just so unbalanced that even if you had short-term up and downs, if I was a long-term investor, debt is a bit of a no-brainer residential is a bit of a no-brainer in my opinion. I like urban logistics because I think with online shopping, last mile delivery, we all seem to want, our Amazon delivery to be made 5 minutes after we ordered it online. I think that's only going to go in one direction. And because of the competition for sites with residential, I think demand for the urban logistics and the money you can make there is really interesting. And my left field one would probably be retail warehouse, which is probably not still flavour of the month, but you're starting on quite a high yield, certainly in historical terms. A lot of the tenants are really good covenants, very little obsolescence because they're sheds. I think obsolescence is a big issue nowadays. And if I was a relatively short-term investor, maybe 5 years time horizon, I would definitely look at prime grade A offices.
Really?
Yeah, I think there's such a lack of supply and there's still not much new development. Again, I'm talking across Western Europe. I just think for a few years, tactically, it's interesting. You just have to look at rents in the city, which are now above £100. Yeah, and I think that's where I put my money at the moment.
Just moving away from Savills and your day-to-day role, talk to you about wheelchair rugby because you got an MBE for services, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, my first point on that, I have got an MBE, not something I particularly use because it's a weird one. I'm unbelievably proud to have it, but also a bit embarrassed. So
that doesn't surprise me, by the way. I feel like that's a theme.
Yeah, okay.
Humility.
Let's move on from that. So I chaired a board for 10 years, a board of brilliant people. I was the only one who worked full-time, so they did far more than me because I was working and most of those were retired or semi-retired. And that is a sport which is run by volunteers and family. And yet someone like me gets an MBE, which is I found a bit embarrassing. Don't get me wrong, I was never going to turn it down, but a bit embarrassing. Funny story about how I found out about it, but if we have time. But
no, tell me. Was it a case of another tap on the shoulder to say, Kevin?
No. So one Friday evening in December, a few years back, I had a call. I was on a train actually coming out of Charing Cross, and I had a call, and this guy goes, "Is this Kevin Aitchison?" I said, "Yeah," and he said, "Oh, my name's so and so from the Palace," and I'm like, "Yeah, okay, yeah." Well, we've been trying to contact you, and I think we've been given the wrong email address. So wanted to ring you and let you know that the Prime Minister is minded to recommend to the Queen at the time, that you be awarded an honour in the New Year's Honours list. And I was like, yeah.
Did you think it was a hoax?
Oh, completely. You
thought it was a mate of yours giving you a call?
And I'm thinking, yeah, okay. Can you give us your proper email address? I gave this guy my email address, and then a few hours later, this email comes through, which all looks very, but I'm still thinking, yeah. And the following day, I was walking the dog, and I just Googled the office. So rather than take the phone number off of the letter, I Googled the name on the letter, and I phoned it. I can remember exactly where I was, and this woman answered, and I said, "Oh, is does so-and-so work there? And she said, yes. And then she went, I bet he phoned you about an honour. And I said, yes. And you think it's a prank? I said, yeah, completely. She said, no, it's not. And I was like, whoa, this is quite... And then me being me, they said, they want to know, the letter says, would you be minded to accept it? So I think they don't want people to turn it down. But then they said, you can't tell anyone at all. So me being me, I literally told no one, including my wife. Literally no one. And then it was announced on New Year's Eve. Amazing, I tell you, to go to the palace, and yeah, what a privilege, but quite undeserved. I was interviewed on Kent Radio at half time of the football matches, and on that I was saying it's all a bit embarrassing, really. But yeah, it was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
I wonder how many calls that lady had at the palace from other people like
I don't
you,
know.
wondering.
Yeah, I don't know.
My mate's pulling my leg.
You
Is this
just
actually
automatically
legit?
think it's a prank. You know, it's not the sort of thing normal people receive. But it was, fantastic.
So why wheelchair rugby?
So my boss, and you would have noticed from this, there are certain people that figure quite big in my life. Nick Cooper from Savills and got me to give up buildings fan. Rob Houston. So Rob Houston, when ING bought out his part of Baring, Houston and Saunders, Rob, who is a fantastic bloke, never struck me as being very materialistic. He set up a charity called Boost. I'll give them a plug, actually. Building on Overlooked Sporting Talent. Rob loves sport. And what they would do in their formative years would dip in and out of other charities. So wheelchair rugby was run by the players for the players. Everyone there is tetraplegic, everyone who plays the sport. The problem is, if you want to get funding from the likes of UK Sport, Sport England, you need good governance. So what his charity Boost did is they sponsored a CEO for a year. And I always remember Rob saying to me, I'm a complete rugby nut, saying to me, I know you love rugby, I'd quite like to leave someone involved. Would you be interested? So I thought, yeah, why not? So I went off up to Stoke Mandeville just to sit at the back of the AGM. Ooh, it was definitely a sport run by the players, for the players. But I got involved. I went to a few events. Then I became a trustee. And then leading up to London 12, the chair, who was in a chair, decided he wanted to try and get back in the GB squad for the games. And there's a direct conflict there as both a player. So he stepped down, and I sort of became chair by default. I had no great desire to be chair. I became chair by default. Very different charities today, because back then, the people who then got on the board were people like a real estate lawyer I knew, an accountant I knew who had recently retired from Grant Thornton, people you sort of knew. Whereas now there's like big interview processes and headhunters, very different back then. So I got involved, say chairman a bit by default. And what's interesting about that sport is often you'd hear someone like me talk about the GB team, the elite end. It wasn't about the elite end. It was about the guy who had just had a diving accident, which was a common cause, or the girl or woman who'd been in a car crash or whatever. But where the elite was important was that if you wanted sponsorship or whatever, it's quite a good game to watch at an elite level, and that was what attracted people in. But London 12 was such a privilege. So I had VIP entrance. How cool was that? So you're in the VIP areas and you got into more than you'd otherwise get into. It was just such a great experience. But that sport, but that's one part of it. The sport as a whole. So when I stepped down, I did it for 10 years. And when I stepped down, it was at the AGM in September of 20. And because of COVID, that was online. So it was remote. Everyone was on video. And the last agenda item was retiring chairs. I completely lost it. Honestly, I was crying. Even now I feel a bit emotional talking about it. I completely lost it. And I got into that thinking, God, I've been lucky in my career. It'd be good to give something back. That sport gave me more than I ever gave it. It was just a remarkable experience. Even just, people in a chair, apart from my grandma back in the day, I'd never really ever spent time with people in a chair. And you sort of, this sounds really naive now, but how do you approach someone who's in a chair, and silly questions like that, which I'd never really thought about. And it was just amazing. And the people who play it, some of them are just the most. I look at some of the things we moan about as, mere normal human beings. And those guys and girls are just phenomenal. Honestly, I get a bit emotional about it. And stepping down was horrible. But again, I'd done it for 10 years. Actually, it's probably a bit too long.
And to your point earlier, you'd run its course.
Yeah.
And it
and my success
else.
is brilliant. But yeah, it needed someone else. And again, I'd met people through that. So the CEO, a guy called David Pond, who's ex-Navy, just the most remarkable guy. 10 years older than me. We're really good friends still now. And those sort of connections you make, again, and they're valuable because they're connections outside of my normal life, which have huge value to me. And I had an email just this morning from the guy who was the ex-Grant Thornton. All of these people are no longer involved, saying, when are we going out for a beer? And, it's just another part of your life. But, yeah, amazing. And I parked charity for a few years, and now I'm sort of thinking of the future. I'm now I feel it's time to get back into a charity. But it's different now because you have all these interview processes. I'm quite involved. But yeah, so watch this space. Watch this space,
indeed. How did you manage your mental health throughout your career, and how do you manage it?
Oh, that's a great question. So when I was younger, I would say to people, I'm a bit of a worrier. When I look back now, and I'll openly talk about this now, I had bigger problems than that. I mean, I talked earlier about how different I was at work to at home. Home, I was a nightmare. I was always angry. I was a rubbish dad. I've got 3 kids who somehow have grown up to be brilliant kids. That's down to my wife. I was never there. 3 kids never went to a sports day. There was always something, our meetings come up. My wife would say, yeah, but surely this is more important. No, work was always more important. And sometimes I think, so my youngest said to me when she was 21, she said, Dad, if you were the same today as you were 10 years ago, we'd have no relationship. You don't know how much that gets you. And sometimes I'm quite happy to talk about this now, because if there's one thing I could share with people who are driven on a career, is other things are more important. None of us are going to lie on our deathbed thinking, wish I'd worked a bit harder. You're just not. And I look back now and I think, and it should have struck me where one day my wife, completely out of the blue, said to me, I've arranged for you to go and see a psychiatrist, which I was like, I don't need to see a psychiatrist, but I went. And I came out and she went, what is it like? I said, complete waste of time. Complete waste of time. And then I would say I had I don't know what you call it, sort of a dawning moment. Probably, weirdly, I found it easier the more responsibility I got, which is really strange. I still think that's strange
Found what
now.
Easier?
To cope with the mental health challenges, the more senior I got at work.
Because?
I don't know. So
you could hide behind people actually executing?
No, I think it was control. Which I don't think means I'm a control freak, but I knew I made decisions and then would stand and fall on those decisions. I don't know why. I can't explain it. But that was sort of when I knew I started changing and being able to control what I was like more. But I miss so much of my kids' upbringing, and I so regret that today. So for you who's got young kids, I would say it's got to be number one priority. And now I always feel I'm trying to make up for it. And that's tough. And I have big regrets around that. And the weird thing was, I then chose to have therapy, bizarrely slightly, after I felt I'd got it all under control, weirdly. I can't really explain that either, but it did sort of help, actually, just to talk to someone who knows nothing about your life, who you've never worked with. And I would recommend that to people, actually. For me, it had a time limit. I sort of felt it ran out of mileage, but for a period it was great. Now I control a lot of that stuff. I'm a bit obsessed by exercise. So, if I don't do exercise on a day, I'll be saying to my wife, I was quite fat when I was younger, and I'll say to her, I'm going to put on weight again. I haven't been for a run today. And so, I find that things like running are sort of means there are two ways of de-stressing for me. One is going for a run or the gym, and the other is going to the pub.
I was going to say.
And one is slightly healthier than the other. I do both, but I do find exercise is brilliant for just calming you down a bit.
Is it all well and good to say, you regret? Maybe I should reframe that. You became CEO and the biggest real estate business.
Only the UK, not all of it.
In
yeah,
the UK, and then set up Knight Frank Investment Management and grew it to $5 billion. Could you have realistically prioritised your mental health better when you were younger and be more present for your kids and being able to achieve what you achieved at the same time?
I don't know the answer to that, but I think you should be able to. And I also think the world is a bit different today. I think companies, when I was young in the 90s, if I'd gone to my boss and said, I think I've got an anxiety problem, and you'd have been like, I actually think that probably would have, as much as my bosses back then were brilliant, I suspect that might have damaged your career. And I think the world today is probably a bit more grown up about things like that. So I can only talk for me. So for me personally, if there was someone that I thought was really good, who's one day said to me, I've got these issues, it would make no difference to me in terms of my view of them at all. And we're in a world today where I believe everyone should be, we are in a world where, if I'm honest, I do think these make it harder for people, for youngsters. The fact we're constantly on phones and scrolling, and Christ, I do it myself. And someone sent me a message yesterday saying, it's bank holiday, why are you answering an email at 5:30 in the morning? That's because I can't sleep. I wake up early. But I think the world should be more tolerant of things. I don't think that should hold you back today.
So going through therapy, there's one thing that is masking or saying the real reason, or the reason you want people to hear. What was the actual underlying reasoning or justification for why you work so hard and why you prioritised your career so much to the neglect of your personal life?
I've worked out that my career has been driven by one thing. I genuinely think this, and I'm not sure it's a good driver of a career, which is fear of failure. So for me, we talked earlier about money and am I always looking for the next step? No, but I've always feared failure. Always. I would go home and, something would have gone wrong and I'll be saying to my wife, I think they're going to sack me. And my wife would be going, what, just because you've done something wrong? That's just what happens. No, they're going to sack me. They're going to sack me. And it was always the fear of failure, the sort of what I perceived as the humiliation of being sacked or getting something wrong. And I really struggled to cope with that, really struggled. Whereas now I think, I look back through my time, I think, God, most things, I know it's a cliche, but most things I have learnt have been from things that have gone wrong. And that is true. When things go swimmingly, you don't actually learn that much because you don't think about it much. So, fear of failure.
It would be remiss of me to have you on the podcast and not ask you about your LinkedIn posts.
Yeah. What do you want to know? My ramblings.
You've been quite prolific in the last year or so in terms of your LinkedIn posts. For a leader in the real estate industry, there's not many who post as often or as vulnerably or as insightfully or as open as you do. Why do you do that?
I'm not really sure. So I got into LinkedIn when I left ING. I was on gardening leave for 3 or 4 months, and someone said to me, if you're not in the market for 3 or 4 months, you need to be on LinkedIn. So I just started writing random things, and it sort of just carried on. To be fair, in the last year, I've probably posted less, but I rarely write about real estate, which is not a conscious thing. I think it just probably shows... I mean, I do. I write, as you say, about leadership. I write sometimes about mental health. And I think they are things which, the mental health side, I'm just conscious of my own life. The leadership is, I've been really fortunate and I've worked for some great people.
So that about 17 times during this conversation.
But it's still true. But I've also seen some really bad leaders. And I think we as an industry, and we're not alone actually, most technical industries, you get people who are technically really, really good, who get promoted to managerial leadership positions. Technically, you could be the best in the world and deservedly earn the most money in your company. Doesn't make you a good leader or manager. And I think we as an industry often get that wrong. I think the legal industry gets that wrong. And I suspect things like engineering get that wrong.
I think it's the Peter paradox, it's called.
Yes, yeah. You get promoted to a position which is above your capabilities, which is often to everyone's detriment, to the individual, but also to the firm who loses them doing what they're really talented at doing. And sometimes I think we forget that, and this is not to say I'm good at it, because I'm not sure I think I am, but people are good at different things. And I think the world forgets that at times. And just because you're technically excellent, or I don't know, the best broker in our industry
fee
in the world,
generator.
That's a classic fee generator, does not automatically mean you're a good manager or a good leader. And I just think business industry needs to think a bit more about that. And the flip side of that is you could get someone who is just not a fee generator and really does not generate fees, but could be a brilliant leader. And I suspect in some industries, possibly including ours in some companies, would never get the chance. And I just think we need to think about leadership a bit more broadly. What it is, I think it's quite hard to define what it is at times. It's quite different to management, in my view. But the key thing for me is always communication. I believe, the things which are really important to me are communication, which again I've probably talked about 17 times, and my biggest value is integrity. Because I think if people who report into you know you have integrity, they'll accept you getting things wrong. If they know you will always support them, even if they've done something wrong or cock something up, I think you'll stand in good stead, and people will see you as a good person to work with and for. And sometimes I think there are too many people who perhaps are a bit too much about what's in it for themselves, who are too focused on their pocket as opposed to, I'm saying that as someone who believes if you do a good job, you get the rewards, as opposed to I want the rewards and then I'll do a good job. It's a subject that I'm really interested in.
And then you get your thoughts down when you're travelling, or you're
normally I'm on a train or sitting at an airport,
commute,
and I'll just write something, and sometimes it will be about. I think I wrote something a couple of weeks ago where my youngest daughter, who's really into Amdram, was on stage. I think partly because what I was like in the past. Whenever I see her on stage, I get really emotional about it, and it's already makes you like proud dad type thing. But they're things I'm genuinely interested in. I think leadership's just an amazing topic because Donald Trump, many people would say Donald Trump is a brilliant leader. Other people would say he's an awful leader. Where you sit depends on your politics, but which is right or wrong? Of course, the answer's neither right or wrong. They're just different.
So what advice would you give to someone who's sat in a business right now, who's committed to doing a really good job, who is probably not going to be the biggest fee earner, was not the loudest in that organisation, but wants to develop or lean into more of their managerial or leadership capabilities, and doesn't have the boss or bosses that you have had who've given them that opportunity? What advice would you give them in terms of being able to make that transition, or maybe take the bull by the horns a little bit more and drive their career forward in a management or leadership capacity?
Do you know, that is a really difficult question to answer, I think. What would I do if I was them? I do think they have to become, at the very least, proficient in what they're doing, because I don't think it's enough to only be a a management leadership type person. I think you do need to be proficient and work hard. The biggest thing, which sometimes I sound like a really old bloke, and I am saying this, sometimes I find with some of the, I don't know, whatever generation you want to call it, Z or whatever it is, that the way people communicate today is very different. It's invariably done by email and WhatsApp. I mean, how many of us are on WhatsApp all the time, including me? It's quite noticeable to me, for example, how rarely you hear people on the phone in an open plan office. And it's like we've lost the ability to do that. And people invariably, if they're on a phone or go into a room, that wasn't like that in the past. So my big bit of advice would be learn to communicate. Start picking up a phone. And in public, as long as it's not confidential, in public forum, because it will give you confidence. I would do that. I would also, I think you've got to be prepared to step outside your comfort zone. I mean, I can remember the first time I was ever asked to do a presentation by Robert Houston, and we used to have this big annual conference, and it was a really big thing for the business. And I was sitting in a sort of breakout area doing some work, and Rob comes over and sits down and we have a chat, and he said, "I'd like to invite you to speak at this year's annual seminar." And I said, "No, I'd really rather not, Rob." "No, Kevin, I'd like to invite you to speak at the seminar." Like, "Rob, I'd really rather not." "I'm not actually inviting you." And I'm like, oh my God, I think the longest presentation I'd ever done was 5 minutes. I'm thinking it'll be a nightmare. I mean, God, I was in a right old panic, even though it was like 3 months away. And he said, "We'll get you some coaching." And this guy comes in, and we were up in we had like a big boardroom, and he made me go to the lectern and just talk about anything. And he stood at the back, and he said to me, "I don't know what I think I talked about rugby." And he said, "I don't know what you're worried about. You're fine." And I'm like, "Oh no, I get really nervous, blah, blah." And he said, "I'll come back tomorrow, but this time I want you to prepare and do something about real estate, just generally, nothing confidential." So I spent about an hour. He arrives, lunchtime. I was in London, Wall in the city, and he said, "Right, we're going outside." Can I swear on this podcast? So we go outside, and there's a war memorial in the middle of the road, lunchtime. He says to me, "You go and stand on the war memorial. I'm going to be over here, but I want to hear you. You've got to project." I'm just thinking, oh my God. I'm actually thinking, shit. And I'm standing on this war memorial. He's stopping people and saying, "This guy's got to do a presentation. He's really nervous." And there must have been 20 people there by the time I finish. And I got a bit of a round of applause. And then he went to me, "If you can do that, you can do anything." And that was so outside of my comfort zone. I will happily present today. I still get really, really nervous. Really
left leg
nervous. That never happened before or since that day. But I get really, really nervous. But that little incident meant I knew I could do it. I've sort of waffled a bit here. But my point is, you need to put yourself out your comfort zone. And I think to show... Funny, I like talking about leadership, but I don't like talking about it suggesting I'm any good at it, because I have no idea whether I am. That's for others to judge. So I'm certainly not a guru on leadership. But to me, it just comes back to people abilities plus the courage to make decisions. You have to put your head above the parapet. And a lot of those decisions will be wrong. But that's just life. And as long as you've made them for the right reasons, i.e. you've thought them through as opposed to just an impulsive, we'll go in that direction, I don't think people will always go with you, as long as they know you've done it for the right reasons.
You're transparent about the realities.
The transparency and the integrity bit are huge to me. I have to be honest, for me, be it my family or anyone else, if I ever found out someone wasn't honest with me, this is probably a failing actually, they would never recover from it in my eyes, because I just think integrity is so important.
Kevin, we're going to ask the final question on this podcast, which is if I give you £500 million, how would you allocate it?
How would I allocate 500 million today? at the moment as a core, quite unexciting, low-risk investor. I would probably put half of it in debt and the other half I'd look longer term and I'd go in residential. As simple as that.
You've had a fascinating career. I think we've just ticked over the 1.5 hour mark.
Oh, sorry about that.
Well done if you've stuck with it. I feel like I could talk to you or keep talking to you. I'm, just to try and extract more lessons, more learnings, more viewpoints. And, it's no real surprise that you've had the career that you have had. Baked in humility, self-deprecation,
reality.
And
but you do need luck. I don't care what anyone says. However hard you work,
create your own luck,
and you need people someone who believes in you.
Yeah, but it says a lot about you that good people will come alongside you as well. And maybe you're not quite as blunt an instrument as you kind of alluded to earlier in our conversation. So thank you so much for sharing the wisdom, learnings, lessons, views, and journey with us on the podcast. And I'm really excited to see what you and the team go on to do moving forward.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Hey, quick one from me. If you enjoyed this conversation, do me a favour and share it with a friend or colleague that you think would get value from this conversation. It would mean the world and help grow the People Property Place podcast. Thank you so much.